framed for murder during the royal festival. She returned knowing the killer's identity. Full video script hook. The rope was still burning red marks into her wrists when Lady Isolde Vantreau opened her eyes for the second time in her life. Not in a prison cell. Not on a scaffold with 10,000 voices screaming for her blood. She was standing in a garden, sunlight warm on her face, wearing a dress she remembered burning 3 months ago. Her hands were clean, no blood, no chains. Just the scent of blooming orchid lilies and the distant sound of servants preparing for a festival that had not happened yet. A festival that, in another life, ended with a duke dead on a marble floor and her own name screamed as his murderer. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest and felt her heart still beating, still alive, still hers. 3 months. She had 3 months before the man she loved would watch her hang and feel nothing. 3 months before her closest friend would spit at her feet and call her a monster. But this time, Isolde knew something she hadn't known before the noose closed around her throat. She knew exactly whose hand had held the blade. And this time she was not going to die quietly. Isolde stood frozen among the orchid lilies for a long moment, waiting for the world to prove itself a dream. It didn't. The wind moved through the hedges exactly as she remembered from 3 months before her death, no, before her death that had not yet happened. Somewhere behind her, a maid's voice called out, cheerful and untouched by tragedy. "My lady, the tailor's here for your festival fitting." Her own name, her own life, given back to her like a gift she had never asked for. She turned slowly, and there in the reflection of the garden fountain she saw her own face, 20 years old, unscarred, unbroken. Not the gaunt, hollow-eyed woman who had knelt before the executioner. She lifted her fingers to her cheek, and for the first time since she had felt the rope tighten around her neck, Isolde Vantreau allowed herself to cry. Not from sorrow, from something sharper. Rage that had been waiting 3 months to breathe. She remembered everything. Every second of that final day played behind her eyes like a wound that refused to close. The founding festival, the grand ballroom glowing gold under 1,000 candles, Duke Corvin Ashwin laughing over a goblet of spiced wine just moments before he collapsed, his lips turning blue, his hand still clutching the fabric of her sleeve as he fell. She remembered the scream that rose from the crowd. She remembered Prince Kellen Dramore's face, the man she had loved since she was 14 years old, twisting from confusion into horror into something far colder as his eyes fixed on her. She was standing closest to him, someone had shouted. The wine was hers to serve. It hadn't been her wine, it had never been her wine. But by the time she opened her mouth to explain, the guards were already dragging her away, and the only person who might have believed her, her dearest friend, Lady Muriel Sable, had looked at her with such disgust that Isolde's voice had simply died in her throat. She remembered the trial, 3 days of lies stacked so cleanly upon one another that even she had begun to doubt her own innocence. She remembered no one stepping forward. Not her father, who had disowned her before the second day of testimony ended, terrified for what her disgrace might do to the family name. Not Kellen, who never once visited her cell, though she had waited every single night certain that the boy who once climbed the garden wall to bring her stolen peaches would not let her die. He let her die. And now the garden fountain rippled gently in front of her, and somewhere in this castle, that same boy was probably practicing his sword forms, utterly unaware that in another version of time, he had stood in a crowd and watched her hang without so much as a flinch. Isolde wiped her face and forced her spine straight. Grief was a luxury for someone who did not know what was coming. She knew the date, she knew the hour. She knew that in exactly 91 days, Duke Corvin Ashwin would drink poisoned wine at the founding festival, and the entire court would look for the nearest convenient woman to blame. What she had not known in her first life was who actually placed the poison in that goblet. She had spent her final weeks in that cold cell, turning the mystery over and over, replaying every face in the ballroom, every gesture, every suspicious glance. And only on the morning of her execution, staring out through the bars at the gray sky, had the truth finally arranged itself in her mind, a truth that came one single day too late to save her. Chancellor Aldous Wren, the quiet man who stood 2 steps behind the king at every gathering. The man who smiled kindly at children and remembered the names of every servant in the palace. The man everyone trusted precisely because he seemed too unremarkable to be dangerous. She had seen him, in her memory now sharpened by death, exchange the smallest of glances with a servant boy near the wine table, a glance so brief that in the chaos of the moment, no one else had thought to notice it. She had seen the same servant boy vanish from the palace records within a week of the trial's end, as though he had never existed at all. And she had understood far too late that Duke Corvin's death had never been about the Duke at all. It had been about power. About a seat at the king's right hand that would open the instant Corvin Ashwin, the last man loyal enough to oppose Ren's growing influence over the crown, was no longer breathing. And Isolde, standing too close, holding the wrong goblet at the wrong moment, had simply been the most convenient shadow to throw across the crime. 91 days. She had 91 days to become someone the Chancellor could not so easily discard. 91 days to gather proof instead of grief, allies instead of illusions, and a plan sharp enough to cut through a decade of the man's careful lies. She looked down at her clean, unshaking hands and made herself a single promise, the same promise she should have made the very first time fate had tried to bury her. This time she would not wait to be saved. This time. She would learn exactly how far a woman with nothing left to lose could go. And Chancellor Ren, wherever he was standing in this castle right now smiling his gentle smile, had absolutely no idea that the ghost of the woman he'd once destroyed was walking toward him with 91 days a second heartbeat and no mercy left in her at all. She turned toward the castle, and for the first time since waking, Isolde Vantreau smiled. It was not a kind smile. The tailor's fitting room felt absurd in its ordinariness, silk swatches, pins glinting in candlelight, a servant girl chattering about ribbon colors for the festival gown Isolde had worn while dying in another life. She let the fabric drape over her shoulders and studied her reflection with new eyes, the way a soldier studies a battlefield rather than a garden. "My lady, you're very quiet today," the seamstress murmured, mouth full of pins. "I'm thinking," Isolde said simply. And she was turning over every name, every face, every conversation that might matter in the 91 days ahead. The first person she needed to see was not Chancellor Ren. Confronting him now with nothing but the memory of a dead woman's suspicion would accomplish exactly what it had the first time: nothing, except perhaps drawing his attention to her early. No. The first person she needed was someone who could move through the palace unseen, who owed her a debt from a life he didn't remember owing. Lord Rainthorn. In her first life, Isolde had barely spoken 20 words to the quiet knight who served in the palace guard under an assumed rank far beneath his actual bloodline. She'd known only rumors, that he was the disowned second son of a border count, that he'd taken a servant's blade wound meant for a child during a market riot 2 years past, that he watched the court with the flat, unreadable patience of a man who trusted no one and needed no one to trust him back. She had not known, until her final week in that cell, that Rainthorn had been the single guard who quietly argued against her immediate execution, who had asked, and been ignored, for a proper investigation into the wine's origin. She had learned this from a sympathetic jailer 2 days before she died, and the knowledge had done nothing but deepen the ache of dying unheard. This time, she intended to hear him first. She found him 3 days later in the Eastern training yard, sparring alone against a wooden post long after the other guards had retired for the evening, his shirt damp with sweat, his expression carved from stone. He didn't look surprised when she approached, only mildly, carefully curious, as if noble ladies wandering into the guard's yard at dusk was an event rare enough to warrant caution rather than courtesy. "Lady Vantreau," he said, inclining his head just enough to be proper. "You're a long way from the East Wing. I need to ask you something strange," Isolde said, "and I need you to answer honestly even if it sounds mad." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." "If a nobleman died at the founding festival, poisoned, in full view of the court, and every finger in the room pointed at the nearest convenient woman, would you believe the easiest answer, or would you look for the one no one else bothered to check?" For a long moment, Rain said nothing at all. The training yard was silent except for the wind moving through the banners overhead. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful neutrality. "That's an oddly specific question, my lady. Humor me." "I've spent 6 years in this palace," he said slowly, "learning that the easiest answer is almost always the wrong one. Guilty men rarely stand close enough to be seen." His gaze sharpened, studying her face the way a man studies a locked door he suspects hides something valuable. "Why do you ask?" Isolde met his eyes and, for the first time since waking in the garden, told someone the truth, carefully edited, but true in its bones. "Because I believe something terrible is being planned for the founding festival, and I believe the man responsible is someone this entire court trusts without question. I need someone who can watch without being noticed, someone who already knows how to look past the easy answer." "And you came to me," he said, "instead of the palace guard captain or your own betrothed, the crown prince." "The captain answers to men who might already be compromised," Isolde said. "And Kellen." She hesitated, old grief flickering behind her ribs before she forced it down. "Kellen believes the best of everyone until it's too late to matter." Something shifted in Rain's expression, not quite a smile, but close to respect. "You're either the most paranoid noblewoman in this castle," he said, "or the most observant one I've met in years." "Perhaps both," Isolde answered. "Will you help me, Lord Thorn?" He studied her a moment longer, and Isolde held her breath, remembering, though he could not, the version of him who had spoken up for her when no one else would, and been ignored anyway. This time she intended to make certain he was not ignored. "I watch," Rain said finally. "I don't act without proof. If what you're suggesting is true, we do this carefully or we do it not at all." "Careful," Isolde agreed, "is exactly what I intend to be." As she turned to leave the training yard, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between suspicion and curiosity. As though he sensed there was a version of this conversation, a version of her, that he was somehow missing. He would learn in time just how much history stood quietly behind her eyes. But not yet. Behind her, unseen by either of them, a servant boy lingered near the yard's outer gate a moment too long before slipping away into the dusk, the same servant boy Isolde would, in 91 days, recognize far too late as the one who vanished from palace records the week after Duke Corvin died. He had already seen her face. He had already seen Rain Thorns. And somewhere in the palace's quiet chancellery, a man with a gentle smile was about to receive a report that a girl who was not supposed to be asking questions had just started asking them anyway. 3 days after the training yard, Isolde was summoned to afternoon tea with Chancellor Aldous Wren. It was not unusual on its surface. Wren hosted small gatherings for the palace's young noblewomen every fortnight, a tradition he'd maintained for years under the guise of mentoring the future ladies of the court in matters of etiquette and diplomacy. In her first life, Isolde had attended a dozen of these gatherings without a flicker of suspicion, charmed like everyone else by his soft laugh and his habit of remembering the smallest details: a sick grandmother, a favorite flower, a birthday 2 months past. This time, walking into his private receiving room with her pulse steady and her expression carefully arranged into polite warmth, Isolde understood she was walking into the den of the man who had ended her life and felt nothing while doing it. "Lady Vantreau," Wren greeted her. Rising from his chair with the same gentle smile she remembered from her execution morning, when he had stood in the crowd's front row watching with an expression of solemn respectful sorrow that she now knew had been a performance for an audience of one himself. "How lovely. I don't believe we've spoken properly since the spring gala." "Chancellor Wren," she said, dipping into a perfect curtsy, "the honor is mine." They spoke for nearly an hour about nothing that mattered: the festival preparations, the weather, a minor trade dispute with the western provinces that Wren explained with the patient, avuncular tone of a man who enjoyed being seen as wise. Isolde watched him the entire time with the practiced patience of a woman who had learned, the hardest way possible, that danger rarely announces itself with a scowl. It was near the end of the tea, as a servant refilled their cups, that Wren said almost idly, "I understand you've taken an interest in palace security of late. Lord Thorn mentioned you asked him some rather pointed questions in the training yard." Isolde's hand did not shake as she lifted her cup. This was the moment, she recognized it instantly, the same delicate testing ground Wren must have walked 100 young nobles through before, watching for panic, for guilt, for the tell of someone who had something to hide. "I'm afraid I've become rather anxious about the festival," she said, letting a note of embarrassed sincerity color her voice. "There was an incident at my cousin's estate last winter, a poisoning, over an inheritance dispute, and I confess it left me somewhat obsessed with the subject of security ever since. Lord Thorn was kind enough to indulge my questions, though I imagine he thought me rather foolish." It was, of course, entirely invented, but Isolde delivered it with the easy, slightly self-deprecating charm of a woman confessing a harmless quirk, and she watched carefully, so carefully, for any crack in Wren's expression. There was none. His smile remained warm, sympathetic, utterly convincing. "Poison is a dreadful thing," he said, shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine distaste. "A coward's weapon. I've always believed a man who resorts to it has already lost whatever honor he began with." The words landed like a slap, precise and deliberate, though his tone never wavered from gentle concern. Isolde smiled back at him and thought, with a cold clarity that surprised even her, "He is enjoying this. He is enjoying watching me squirm without knowing that I know." "I'm sure you're right, Chancellor," she said softly. "I do hope nothing so terrible ever happens here." "As do I, my dear," Wren said, and reached across to pat her hand with fatherly warmth. "As do I." She left his receiving room 20 minutes later with her composure intact, and her stomach twisted into knots so tight she had to stop in an empty corridor and press her palm flat against the cold stone wall just to breathe. He had looked her directly in the eyes and spoken of poison as a coward's weapon. knowing, she was almost certain now, exactly what he intended to use it for in less than 3 months' time. He suspects nothing yet, she told herself. He is simply careful with everyone. That is how he has survived this long unnoticed. But some small, frightened part of her whispered a different, colder truth, or he suspects everything, and this was his way of telling you that he already knows you remember. That night she met Rain again, this time in the shadow of the old library wing where the guards rarely patrolled. She told him everything about the tea, every word, every gesture, every unsettling pat of Ren's hand. Rain listened in silence, arms folded, jaw tight. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You told him about your questions in the yard through me. That means he already has someone watching closely enough to report a private conversation within 3 days." "I know," Isolde said. "That's not paranoia, my lady. That's a man with eyes everywhere in this palace, and we have no idea how many of those eyes are watching us right now." Isolde looked past him, down the dark corridor toward the wing where, in another life, she had once believed herself safe simply because she had done nothing wrong. "Then we stop meeting in corridors," she said. "And we find out exactly who's been reporting on me before they report anything else." Rain's eyes flicked toward the shadows at the corridor's far end, and for one heartbeat, Isolde could have sworn she saw the faint outline of a small, retreating figure disappear around the corner, moving with the quick, practiced silence of someone who had done this before. Someone who had perhaps been listening the entire time. His name, Isolde would learn 2 days later through careful, quiet questioning of the kitchen staff, was Elian, a boy of perhaps 16 who had joined the palace service only 8 months prior. Sponsored, according to the servants' registry, by a minor merchant family from the capital's outer district. No one seemed to know him well. He kept to himself, performed his duties competently, and had an unusual habit of appearing in corridors far from his assigned wing at hours that made little sense for a boy meant to be polishing silver in the East kitchens. In her first life, Isolde had never known his name at all. She had only remembered his face in the final, desperate hours before her execution, and by then it had been too late to matter. This time, she intended his name to matter a great deal. "He's not what he claims to be," Rain said, the two of them once again meeting in secret, this time in a disused chapel on the palace grounds that had fallen out of favor since the Queen's death a decade past. "I checked the merchant family listed as his sponsor. They exist, but they have no record of any relation named Elian and no memory of sponsoring a palace servant at all." "Ren placed him," Isolde said. "It wasn't a question. That would be my guess, but guesses don't hang a chancellor, my lady. We need him to talk, or we need proof that doesn't depend on his testimony at all." Isolde had spent every night since her tea with Ren turning the problem over, and she had arrived slowly at an uncomfortable conclusion. Proof would not fall into her lap. She would have to build it piece by careful piece, the way a mason builds a wall stone by stone, and the first stone was understanding exactly what role the boy Elian was meant to play on the night of the festival. "I want you to follow him," she said. "Not question him, not confront him, simply watch where he goes, who he speaks to, what tasks he's given in the weeks before the festival. If Ren is planning to use him again, he'll need to prepare him." Rain nodded slowly. "And what will you be doing while I play shadow to kitchen boy?" "I'll be doing what I do best," Isolde said, allowing herself the ghost of a smile. "I'll be making myself impossible to ignore." It was she had realized over the past week. The second half of her plan, not merely gathering proof, but ensuring that when the proof finally surfaced, there would be enough people watching, enough witnesses of unimpeachable standing, that Ren could not simply bury the truth beneath his influence the way he had buried it the first time. A quiet accusation from a disgraced noblewoman had been easy to silence. A public reckoning, witnessed by half the court, would not be. To that end, Isolde began, carefully and deliberately, to rebuild the very reputation that had crumbled so completely in her first life, not out of vanity, but as armor. She accepted invitations she would once have declined. She spoke thoughtfully in gatherings where she had once stayed silent. She sought out Princess Alara, whom she had served loyally for 2 years before her death, and who had wept, Isolde remembered this with a bitter ache, at her execution, though even the princess's tears had not been enough to stop it. "You seem different lately," Princess Alara observed one afternoon, the two of them walking the palace's rose garden while attendants trailed a respectful distance behind. "Sharper somehow, I mean that as a compliment." "I've simply realized," Isolde said carefully, "how little time any of us truly have and how foolish it is to waste it being quiet when something needs saying." Alara laughed, bright and unsuspecting. "Now you sound like my father's war advisors. Should I be worried, Isolde?" "Only if I'm wrong about something important," Isolde said, "and I intend not to be." She meant it as a joke, but the princess's smile faltered slightly, some instinct catching the weight beneath the words. You really have changed, Alara murmured. What happened to you? Isolde looked out over the roses, remembering a scaffold, a rope, a crowd that had not raised a single voice to save her, and thought, I died, Alara. I died believing the people I loved most would eventually see the truth, and none of them ever did. I am not making that mistake twice, but aloud she only said, I suppose I've simply grown up. That evening, Rain found her in the library wing with news that turned her blood cold. Elian had been seen delivering a sealed letter, not through the normal palace courier system, but personally on foot to a townhouse 3 streets from the palace gates belonging according to property records Rain had traced through a contact in the city registrar's office. To a merchant known to deal in rare imported wines. The same wines served at the founding festival, Isolde said quietly. The same, Rain confirmed. And the letter was sealed with wax bearing no house crest at all. Whoever sent it didn't want it traced. Isolde closed her eyes, the pieces beginning, finally, to align into something resembling a shape. Ren was reaching out quietly to whoever supplied the festival wine, laying groundwork weeks in advance, exactly as he must have done in her first life. Except this time, she and Rain were close enough behind him to see the shadow of his hand moving. We need to know what's in that letter, she said. Rain's jaw tightened. That means breaking into a merchant's private townhouse and stealing correspondence meant for a man powerful enough to have us both quietly disappeared if we're caught. Isolde met his eyes, steady and unflinching, the memory of a rope around her throat sharpening every word that followed. Then we make absolutely certain we aren't caught. The townhouse belonging to the wine merchant, a man named Osric Dane, sat in a quiet, respectable street lined with lantern posts that made Isolde's plan considerably more difficult than she would have liked. Rain had scouted the property for 2 full days before declaring the servants' entrance at the rear the only viable point of access. Unguarded after midnight, when the household staff retired and Dane himself, according to reliable palace gossip, preferred to spend his evenings drinking at a private gentleman's club near the merchant quarter. You're not coming, Rain said flatly, the night of the break-in, as the two of them crouched in the shadow of a garden wall 2 streets over. I am absolutely coming, Isolde said. I know what Ren's seal looks like from state correspondence I copied for Princess Alara for 2 years. You don't. If there's a document in that house that ties back to him, I need to see it with my own eyes, not hear a second-hand description. Rain exhaled through his teeth, clearly unhappy, but he did not argue further, a small victory Isolde noted with quiet satisfaction. In her first life, she had never once been given the chance to fight for her own survival with her own 2 hands. This time she intended to use them. The rear entrance proved exactly as unguarded as Rain had promised. They slipped through the servants' door into a narrow scullery corridor, the house dark and silent around them, and made their way with careful, deliberate steps toward Dane's private study, where Rain's earlier scouting had revealed a locked writing desk that seemed the most likely home for sensitive correspondence. The lock gave way to a set of thin metal picks Rain produced from inside his boot with the ease of a man who had done this many times before, a skill Isolde filed away unsurprised given everything else she'd learned about the quiet, watchful night over the past weeks. Inside the desk, beneath a ledger of mundane trade accounts, they found it, a small stack of letters bound with plain twine, each sealed with the same unmarked wax Rain had described from Elian's delivery. Isolde's hands trembled slightly as she broke the first seal and unfolded the parchment by the thin beam of moonlight through the study window. The letter contained no signature, no name at all. But the handwriting, precise, elegant, faintly slanted, matched exactly the correspondence Isolde had spent 2 years copying for the palace chancellery under Ren's own supervision. Ensure the wine reserved for the head table arrives separately from the general stock, the letter read, and that the particular vintage discussed is delivered to my personal attendant on the morning of the festival, not before. Discretion, as always, will be rewarded generously. What follows this festival will secure both our futures for a very long time. Isolde read it twice, her heart hammering, and then a third time, committing every word to memory before carefully refolding it exactly as it had been. This is it, she whispered. This is proof he's arranging something specific for the festival wine. It's proof someone is, Rain murmured, peering over her shoulder at the parchment. There's no name, no seal, any competent magistrate would call it circumstantial at best. But the handwriting could be argued as forged or imitated or simply similar. My lady, I believe you. I believe every word of what you're telling me. But belief isn't evidence, and a chancellor with a decade of influence over the crown will have a dozen ways to make circumstantial evidence disappear before it ever reaches a magistrate's desk. Isolde's jaw tightened, frustration and fear warring behind her ribs. She had risked everything, her reputation, her safety, Rain's life alongside her own, and still, the proof slipped just out of reach. Exactly as it had in those final desperate days before her execution, when suspicion alone had not been enough to save her. "Then we take it," she said. "We take the letter and we find a Leon and we make him talk. And if Ren notices the letter is missing before we're ready to move, he'll simply accelerate his plans or abandon this scheme for another we won't see coming until it's too late." Isolde stared down at the parchment in her hands, torn between the desperate urge to seize the only tangible proof she had ever held and the cold, careful logic of a man who had clearly survived far more dangerous games than this one. "Copy it," she said finally. "Word for word in your own hand. We leave the original exactly where we found it, and we carry the copy as our record so that if it disappears later, we still have something." Rain looked at her for a long moment, something like genuine respect flickering behind his careful eyes. "That's a good plan," he said quietly, "better than mine would have been." He copied the letter swiftly by moonlight while Isolde kept watch at the study door, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears, every creak of the old house sending ice through her veins. When he finished, they returned the original to its place beneath the ledger, exactly as they'd found it, and slipped back out through the scullery corridor into the cool night air. They were 3 streets away, finally allowing themselves to breathe, when a voice spoke out of the shadows behind them, quiet, familiar, and utterly without warmth. "Lady Vantreau, Lord Thorn. I confess, I did not expect to find either of you wandering the merchant quarter so very late at night." Isolde turned, her blood running cold, to find Chancellor Aldous Wren standing beneath a lantern post, his gentle smile fixed firmly in place, his eyes glittering with something that was no longer even attempting to look kind. For one suspended, terrible heartbeat, no one moved. Isolde felt Rain shift almost imperceptibly beside her, his weight settling into a stance she recognized, even in her panic, as readiness, the careful balance of a man prepared to fight if fighting became necessary. "Chancellor," Isolde said, forcing her voice into something resembling calm even as her heart slammed against her ribs, "you're rather far from the palace yourself." "I might say the same," Wren replied smoothly, stepping closer, his hands folded behind his back in a posture of unhurried authority. "Though I imagine our reasons differ considerably, I was visiting an old friend nearby. And you?" "A private matter," Isolde said, "nothing that concerns the Chancellery." Wren's smile did not waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation, swift and cold, the same look she imagined he must have worn the moment Duke Corvin's goblet touched his lips in her first life. "Curious," he said softly, "that a private matter would bring the future princess consort and a palace guard to this particular street, at this particular hour, so near the townhouse of a merchant who happens to supply the palace's festival wine." Isolde's stomach dropped, he knew. Or if he did not know precisely, he knew enough to suspect, and suspicion, in the hands of a man like Wren, was very often all that was required. "Coincidence, Chancellor," she said, holding his gaze with every ounce of composure she possessed. "Of course," Wren said pleasantly. "I do so love coincidences." He studied her for a long moment, and Isolde forced herself not to flinch beneath the weight of his scrutiny, not to let a single muscle betray the terror clawing up her throat. "Lady Vantreau, might I offer you a piece of advice from an old man who has spent his life watching this court devour its own? I would be grateful for it," she said carefully. "Curiosity," Wren said, "is a beautiful quality in the young. But it has a way of leading people into rooms they were never meant to enter, and toward answers that, once found, cannot be unlearned." His voice remained gentle throughout, warm even, and that was precisely what made it so chilling. "I would hate to see a girl of your evident intelligence come to harm chasing shadows that don't concern her. Is that a warning, Chancellor? It's concern, my lady, nothing more." He smiled once more, that same fatherly warmth she remembered from 100 pleasant conversations in her first life, and inclined his head in farewell. "I do hope you'll both find your way home safely. The streets grow dangerous for wanderers after dark." He turned and walked away into the darkness, his footsteps unhurried, utterly composed, and Isolde did not release the breath she'd been holding until his silhouette had vanished entirely around a distant corner. "He knows," Rain said quietly, once they were certain they were alone. "Not everything, but enough." "Enough to move faster than we're ready for," Isolde whispered, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. "He'll change his plan, or accelerate it. We've lost whatever advantage we had." "Maybe not entirely," Rain said, his expression thoughtful even through the tension still lining his shoulders. "A man like Wren doesn't survive a decade at the center of court politics by panicking. He'll be cautious, not reckless." My guess is he'll watch us now more closely than before, waiting to see what we do next before he commits to changing anything. Then we need to be smarter than watching, Isolde said. We need a Leon. If Ren suspects we're close, he may try to remove any loose thread that could connect back to him, and a Leon is the loosest thread of all. Rain's face went grim in the lantern light. You mean he might silence the boy? I mean, Isolde said, the memory of her own unheard voice in a prison cell rising bitter in her throat, that I refuse to let another innocent person disappear from this story simply because they were useful to a man who values nothing but his own advancement. They found Elian's small room in the palace servants' quarters 2 nights later only to discover it stripped bare. No belongings, no trace that a boy named Elian had ever slept there at all. The palace registry updated within the same week to show no record of his employment whatsoever, as though he had never existed. Isolde stood in the empty room, cold dread pooling in her stomach, and understood with terrible clarity that she was watching history repeat itself in real time. The same vanishing act that had in her first life erased the only witness who might have saved her, except this time it was happening weeks before the festival instead of after. And she and Rain had been close enough to see the boy disappear and still hadn't been fast enough to stop it. We were too slow, she whispered. Or, Rain said grimly, staring at the bare little room, he was always going to disappear regardless of what we did. Ren doesn't leave loose threads dangling, my lady. He cuts them the moment they stop being useful. Isolde closed her eyes, thinking of a servant boy of 16 who had likely never understood the full weight of what he'd been drawn into, and made herself a quiet, furious promise beneath her breath that whatever had happened to Elian, whatever fate Ren had arranged for him, it would be the last innocent life the Chancellor spent so carelessly before Isolde finally made him answer for all of them. News of Elian's disappearance reached Isolde through the servant's grapevine only 3 days later, and it was not the news she had feared. He had not vanished into some dark alley, silenced permanently for his usefulness. He had, according to whispered kitchen gossip, been reassigned abruptly to a distant countryside estate belonging to a cousin of Chancellor Ren's, sent away, apparently on urgent family business that no one could quite explain. It was Isolde understood the moment she heard it, precisely the kind of quiet, deniable solution a careful man would choose over something as risky and irreversible as murder. Remove the loose thread from the palace, entirely place him somewhere isolated and controlled, and ensure that if anyone ever came asking questions, there would be nothing incriminating left to find. We need to reach him before Ren decides reassignment isn't containment enough, Isolde told Rain, the two of them once again meeting in the disused chapel that had become their unlikely war room. That estate is 4 days' ride from the capital, Rain said. If either of us leaves the palace for over a week, especially now that Ren suspects us, it will look exactly like what it is, an attempt to reach a witness he's already tried to remove. Isolde pressed her fingers against her temples, exhaustion and frustration mounting in equal measure. Every path forward seemed to close the moment she reached for it, exactly as it had in her first life, except this time she at least had the terrible comfort of knowing she was fighting rather than simply waiting to die. It was in this moment of mounting desperation that she made a decision she had avoided for weeks, one that frightened her more than breaking into a merchant's townhouse ever had. She went to see Prince Kellen Draymore. She found him in the palace's private training hall, sparring with the same easy, confident grace she remembered from a lifetime of loving him. The boy who had once climbed a garden wall for stolen peaches, who had promised her beneath a summer sky years ago that he would always believe her before he believed anyone else. She remembered his face at her trial, cold and closed and utterly unrecognizable, and had to force herself not to flinch as he lowered his practiced sword and smiled at her with the same warmth he had shown her 100 times before his eventual betrayal. Isolde, he said, surprised and pleased in equal measure. This is an unexpected pleasure. You've been rather scarce these past weeks. I need to speak with you, she said, about something serious, and I need you to hear me completely before you decide what to think of it. Something in her tone must have carried weight because his easy smile faded into careful attention. You're worrying me already, he said. Go on. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her mind, weighing exactly how much to reveal, knowing that too little would accomplish nothing and too much would risk sounding like the ravings of a paranoid, hysterical woman, the very dismissal that had cost her everything the first time. She chose her words with the precision of a woman who understood, now, exactly how fragile trust could be. I believe Chancellor Ren is planning something dangerous for the founding festival, she said. I believe he intends to poison Duke Corvin Ashwin, and I believe he has already begun laying groundwork to ensure someone else takes the blame when it happens. Kellen's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked uncomfortably close to disbelief. Isolde, that's a serious accusation to level against the crown's own chancellor. Do you have proof? I have a copied letter with instructions about the festival wine, written in handwriting I recognize from years of chancellery correspondence. I have a servant boy who delivered secret messages to a wine merchant and then vanished from the palace the moment we began asking questions about him. I have Ren himself, warning me in the street at midnight to stop chasing shadows that don't concern me. Kellen was quiet for a long moment, and Isolde watched his face carefully, desperate to see some flicker of the boy who had once promised to always believe her first. Isolde, he said finally, gently, I hear how frightened you are, but you're describing circumstantial fragments, not evidence. A copied letter with no name attached. A servant boy reassigned to a country estate, which happens constantly in palace service. A warning from a man who might simply have been genuinely concerned for your safety, wandering the merchant quarter at midnight. He reached for her hand, his expression earnest and worried in a way that, in her first life, would once have melted every doubt in her chest. Chancellor Ren has served this crown faithfully for over a decade. I understand you have concerns, but accusing him of a murder that hasn't even happened yet, without solid proof could ruin you, Isolde. It could ruin us. There it was. The same gentle, well-meaning skepticism that had in another life cost her everything, not cruelty, not malice. Simply a comfortable man's unwillingness to believe that comfortable, trusted things could hide monstrous truths beneath them. I'm not asking you to arrest him, Kellen, she said, keeping her voice steady though something inside her chest was breaking quietly all over again. I'm asking you to simply watch him, carefully, discreetly, and if I'm wrong you'll have lost nothing but a little attention, but if I'm right. If you're right, Kellen said slowly, then I will stand beside you completely, I promise you that. But Isolde, I need you to be careful. If Ren truly is as dangerous as you believe, and he learns you're actively investigating him, I don't know what he might do to protect himself. It was Isolde realized with a hollow, aching clarity. The closest thing to belief she was going to get from him, not full conviction, but a fragile conditional promise offered by a man who genuinely loved her, but had never once learned to trust his own instincts over the comfortable weight of established authority. It would have to be enough. It would have to be because in her first life she had received nothing from him at all, and this, however imperfect, was already more than she had ever been given before. Thank you, she whispered, and meant it, even as some small, exhausted part of her understood with painful certainty that when the festival finally arrived, she could not afford to place her survival in the hands of anyone's belief but her own. The weeks that followed passed in a strange, suspended tension, each day bringing Isolde closer to the founding festival and further from any certainty that she would survive it. Ren, true to Rain's prediction, grew neither reckless nor careless. He greeted Isolde with the same warm, fatherly smile at every court gathering, inquired politely after her health, complimented her gowns, and gave absolutely no indication that a midnight confrontation on a merchant street had ever taken place at all. It was, Isolde thought more than once during those long weeks, almost worse than open hostility. This patient, unhurried calm, as though Ren had already calculated every possible move she might make and found none of them sufficiently threatening to warrant panic. Rain continued his quiet surveillance wherever possible, though the Chancellor's own vigilance seemed to have doubled since the townhouse encounter, making careless movement dangerous for either of them. Kellen, true to his fragile promise, began asking discreet questions of his own, inquiries about wine shipments, about the merchant Osric Dane, about Elian's sudden reassignment, though he confided to Isolde with visible frustration that every answer he received seemed frustratingly, suspiciously ordinary. Everything checks out, he told her one evening, pacing the length of her private sitting room with restless energy. The wine shipment records are in order. The merchant has served the palace for 11 years without incident. Elian's reassignment paperwork lists a genuine family estate with genuine relatives, however distant. If Ren truly is guilty of something, Isolde, he has covered every trace of it so thoroughly that I cannot find a single loose thread to pull. That's precisely because he's had a decade to learn exactly how thorough he needs to be, Isolde said quietly. Men who survive this long at the center of power don't do so by accident, Kellen. They do it by anticipating every question before it's asked. It was during this long, frustrating stretch of waiting that Isolde came to understand something she had never fully grasped in her first, shorter life. That revenge, real revenge worthy of the name, was rarely a single dramatic act of violence or exposure. It was patience. It was the slow, careful accumulation of small advantages, gathered quietly over weeks and months, until the moment finally arrived when all of them combined could tip a single decisive scale. She spent those weeks doing precisely that. She cultivated relationships with the palace's kitchen staff, learning through careful, friendly conversation exactly how the festival's wine service would be organized this year, which servers would be assigned to the head table, which storage cellar would house the reserved vintages, which hours the wine would sit unguarded before the festival's opening toast. She spent time with Princess Alara, gently steering conversation toward the topic of festival security until the princess herself unprompted suggested doubling the guard presence near the head table, simply as a precaution. A suggestion Isolde had planted with such careful subtlety that Alara believed the idea entirely her own, and she spent long, quiet evenings with rain pouring over the copied letter again and again, searching for any detail they might have overlooked, until one night, staring at the parchment for perhaps the 100th time, Isolde's eyes caught on a single phrase she had read dozens of times without truly seeing it. "What follows this festival will secure both our futures for a very long time," she read aloud slowly. "Both our futures. Rain, that's not a man acting alone." Rain sat forward sharply, his eyes narrowing on the parchment. "You're right. I've read past that line a dozen times without registering it. Ren isn't planning this by himself, there's someone else." Isolde's mind raced backward through every gathering, every conversation, every face she had watched carefully over the past weeks, searching for anyone whose ambitions might align closely enough with Ren's to warrant a partnership this dangerous. And slowly, with a cold, sick certainty settling in her stomach, one face rose to the surface of her memory, a face she had trusted completely in her first life, right up until the moment that face had looked at her with open disgust and turned away forever. "Muriel," Isolde whispered, "Lady Muriel Sable." The realization sat like a stone in Isolde's chest for 2 full days before she found the courage to test it. Muriel Sable had been her closest friend since childhood, the daughter of a minor viscount whose family fortunes had dwindled steadily over the past decade, a young woman whose sharp wit and fierce loyalty had made her in Isolde's first life one of the very few people she trusted completely. And yet, Muriel's family had grown suspiciously prosperous over the past 2 years, a fact Isolde had never once questioned in her first life, too consumed by her own concerns to notice her dearest friend's sudden new gowns, the unexplained repairs to her family's crumbling estate, the quiet whispers among the servants about debts mysteriously settled. Isolde tested the theory carefully, inviting Muriel to tea in her private chambers under the guise of ordinary friendship, watching every word, every gesture with the sharpened attention of a woman who had learned, through bitter experience, exactly how dangerous a familiar, trusted face could be. "You've seemed distracted lately," Muriel observed, stirring honey into her tea with practiced elegance. "Court gossip says you've been asking rather strange questions about palace security. Is everything all right, Isolde?" "I've simply grown cautious," Isolde said lightly, watching Muriel's face for any flicker of tension. "There's been talk of concerning things ahead of the festival." "Concerning things," Muriel repeated, her tone carefully neutral, though something flickered behind her eyes that Isolde, watching now with the desperate focus of a drowning woman, did not miss. "What kind of concerning things?" "Oh, nothing certain," Isolde said, keeping her voice deliberately light, deliberately careless. "Just rumors about the wine service. Someone mentioned the Chancellor's been unusually involved in the festival preparations this year, which struck me as odd, given how little interest he's shown in such matters in years past." It was a small, deliberate lie, dropped casually into the conversation like bait into still water, and Isolde watched Muriel's hand pause, almost imperceptibly, halfway through lifting her teacup to her lips. "I hadn't noticed," Muriel said, her voice a fraction too even. "Though I suppose the Chancellor takes his duties seriously, as he always has." The recovery was smooth, practiced even, but Isolde had spent 3 months now learning to read exactly this kind of careful composure, and beneath Muriel's polished calm, she saw something that broke her heart all over again, the unmistakable flicker of a woman who knew far more than she was willing to say. "Muriel," Isolde said quietly, setting down her own cup, "if there was ever something you needed to tell me, something difficult, something that frightened you, you know you could trust me with it, don't you? Whatever it was." For one long, suspended moment, something vulnerable and afraid moved behind Muriel's eyes, and Isolde felt a desperate, foolish hope rise in her chest that perhaps, this time her friend might finally choose differently than she had before. But the moment passed. Muriel's expression smoothed back into practiced pleasantness, and she smiled the same warm, familiar smile Isolde had trusted for over a decade. "Of course, Isolde, there's nothing to tell, you worry too much these days." She left shortly after, and Isolde sat alone in her sitting room for a long time afterward, grief and fury warring in equal measure behind her ribs. She had known on some level from the moment she'd reread that letter's fateful phrase, "both our futures," exactly whose face would eventually surface. But knowing it and feeling it settle, cold and undeniable, into the center of her chest were entirely different kinds of pain. She thought of her execution morning, of Muriel's face in the crowd, twisted with what she had believed in her first life was heartbroken disgust at a friend's supposed betrayal. She understood now with sickening clarity that it had never been discussed at Isolde's imagined crime at all. It had been something far colder, the calculated relief of a woman watching an inconvenient witness silenced permanently, and grief perhaps, but grief for the friendship she herself had chosen to destroy rather than confess. "She's involved," Isolde told Rain that night, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know the full extent of it, but she knows something, she's protecting something. Whatever debt her family owes Ren, it's bought her silence, and I suspect it's bought quite a bit more than that." Rain's expression was grim, though not surprised. He had, Isolde realized, likely suspected something of the sort for longer than he'd said aloud, sparing her the pain of the suspicion until she'd arrived at it herself. "If Lady Sable is genuinely complicit," he said carefully, "she may also be the weakest link in whatever arrangement Ren has built. A woman motivated by desperation and family debt is not the same as a man motivated by decades of ambition. Desperation can be turned, my lady, if approached correctly." Isolde closed her eyes, exhaustion and grief and a strange, aching flicker of hope all tangled together in her chest. "I don't want to turn her, Rain, I want my friend back. The one I thought I had before all of this began." "I know," Rain said quietly, and for the first time since she'd met him in this second life, he reached out and covered her hand with his own, a small, steady gesture of comfort that surprised them both. "But the festival is 11 days away, and I think, if we're careful, there may be one path left that gives you both your friend and your justice." Isolde looked up at him, searching his face in the candlelight, and for the first time in 3 long, exhausting months, allowed herself to feel something other than grief and rage flicker faintly to life in her chest. "Then we have 11 days to find it," she said. "Let's not waste a single one of them." The night of the founding festival arrived exactly as Isolde remembered it, the ballroom glowing beneath 1,000 candles, silk and jewels catching the light, the low murmur of 100 conversations rising and falling like a tide. But this time she did not stand at the edge of the crowd unaware. This time every piece was in place. 11 days had been enough. Barely. She had gone to Muriel 3 days before the festival alone, without Rain, without witnesses, and told her everything, not as an accusation, but as a confession of her own fear, her own desperate hope that the friend she remembered still existed somewhere beneath whatever fear had bought her silence. She had watched Muriel break slowly across the length of that conversation, tears finally spilling free, as she admitted in a whisper that Ren held her family's crushing debts, that he had promised to erase them entirely in exchange for small, seemingly harmless favors, carrying messages offering distractions. Ensuring Isolde herself remained pleasantly occupied and unsuspecting during the weeks leading to the festival. "I didn't know he meant to kill anyone," Muriel had wept. "I swear to you, Isolde, I didn't know it would go this far." Whether that was entirely true, Isolde could not say for certain, and some quiet, wounded part of her suspected she would spend a long time deciding how much of her old friendship could survive what had been broken. But desperation, as Rain had promised, could indeed be turned, and Muriel, terrified and guilt-stricken, had finally agreed to help set right what she had helped set in motion. Now standing in the glittering ballroom with Rain positioned discreetly near the wine service and Kellen finally. Fully convinced by the mounting evidence Muriel herself had confirmed. Stationed with a contingent of trusted guards, near the head table, Isolde watched Chancellor Aldous Ren move through the crowd with his familiar gentle smile, utterly unaware that every step of his careful plan had already been anticipated. She watched him approach the head table as the opening toast neared, watched his hand move with practiced, unhurried ease toward the reserved vintage that Elian had once delivered instructions about, watched him reach into his sleeve for the small vial Muriel had warned them he would carry. Now Isolde breathed. Rain moved first, intercepting the goblet before it ever reached Duke Corvin's hand, while Kellen's guards closed in around Ren with swift, practiced efficiency that left no room for escape or denial. The ballroom's cheerful murmur collapsed into stunned, gasping silence as the truth unfolded in front of 100 witnesses at once. The vial in Ren's sleeve, the poison confirmed by a court physician, within minutes Muriel stepping forward trembling, but resolute to confirm every detail of the scheme she had once helped conceal. Ren's composure finally spectacularly cracked. This is absurd, he snarled, his gentle mask falling away entirely to reveal something colder, hungrier, uglier beneath it. I have served this crown for over a decade. You would take the word of a hysterical girl and a disgraced knight over mine. I would take the word, King Aldwin himself said, rising from his seat, near the head table, his voice carrying with terrible authority across the silent ballroom, of my own daughter's trusted lady, my son's betrothed. And a knight who has served this palace with more honor in 6 years than you have shown in 10. Take him. Isolde watched the guards drag Ren from the ballroom, watched his gentle smile replaced entirely by naked, furious hatred as his eyes found hers across the crowd. The same eyes that had watched her hang without flinching in a life that would now never come to pass. You should have died, he hissed at her as they pulled him past. You were supposed to die. I did, Isolde said quietly, meeting his gaze without a trace of fear. And then I came back to make certain you would answer for it. The festival did not end in celebration that night, but in something far more valuable to Isolde than joy, resolution. Duke Corvin Ashwin lived. Ren was stripped of every title and dragged toward a trial that would, in the weeks to come, unravel a decade of quiet corruption at the heart of the crown's own chancellery. Muriel, her role in the conspiracy weighed carefully against her final courageous confession, was spared execution, but exiled from court, her family's debts settled by the crown in exchange for her full cooperation. A mercy Isolde herself had quietly requested, unable, even now, to fully abandon what remained of a friendship she still mourned. And Kellen, standing beside her in the aftermath of chaos, finally took her hand with the same open, unguarded warmth she remembered from a lifetime ago, before betrayal had ever entered either of their stories. I should have believed you from the very first day, he said quietly. I'm sorry it took me so long to trust what you already knew. You believed me eventually, Isolde said. That's more than I ever thought I'd get. Later, standing alone on a quiet balcony above the emptying ballroom, Isolde felt a familiar presence settle beside her at the railing. Rain said nothing at first, simply stood with her in comfortable silence, watching the last of the festival's candles gutter out below. You did it, he said finally. Everything you set out to do. We did it, Isolde corrected softly. I would have died in that cell a second time without you. Rain turned to look at her, something warm and unguarded finally breaking through the careful stillness he wore like armor. Then perhaps, he said, we've earned the right to build something neither of us has had before. A future we actually choose instead of one that simply happens to us. Isolde looked out over the quieting palace grounds, at the stars scattered thick and bright above the towers, and thought of a woman who had once knelt before an executioner believing her story had already ended. It hadn't ended. It had simply been waiting for her to stop being afraid of writing it herself. I'd like that, she said quietly, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, Isolde Vantreau finally fully believed her own future was hers to keep. SEO packed clickbait titles 1. She died framed for his murder, then returned knowing the killer's face too. The Chancellor poisoned a duke, and blamed the wrong woman twice 3. Everyone abandoned her at her execution, so she rewrote the whole story 4. She had 91 days to stop her own murder from happening again 5. Her best friend betrayed her once, this time she saw it coming. Description. At the kingdom's grandest festival, a duke collapses, poisoned in front of the entire court, and every accusing finger points at Lady Isolde Vantreau. Abandoned by her betrothed, disowned by her own father, and betrayed by her closest friend, she is executed for a crime she never committed. But death is not the end of her story. Waking 3 months in the past with every memory intact, Isolde finally knows the true identity of the killer hiding behind a gentle smile in the highest circles of power. This time, she won't wait to be saved. With a quiet knight as her only ally, she must gather proof, expose a decade of corruption, and confront the people who let her die before the festival's poisoned toast can ever be raised again. A dark, emotional revenge fantasy about betrayal, strategy, and second chances. SEO keywords. Revenge fantasy audiobook villainous reincarnation royal court betrayal murder mystery romance second chance story. AI disclaimer: this video's story, narration, and visuals are AI generated, AI assisted, and created for educational and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. Viral hashtags revenge fantasy # reincarnation story royal court drama. Thumbnail prompt thumbnail AI image generation prompt. An 8K Ultra UHD hyperdetailed cinematic dark fantasy royal court illustration split into 2 dramatic halves. Left half. A striking young noblewoman with pale skin, sharp, determined eyes, and long dark hair partially braided with gold thread. Wearing an elegant black and crimson gown with gold filigree embroidery, standing in a powerful 3/4 close-up, posed, chin lifted, one hand pressed against her chest, Near a torn strand of rope still faintly visible at her wrist, her expression, a mix of grief transforming into cold resolve. Dramatic rim lighting from behind casting a golden red glow across her jawline, dark moody, shadows framing her face, cinematic depth of field. Right half, a grand Gothic royal ballroom mid-chaos, tall gold candelabras, a shattered wine goblet frozen mid-fall, with red wine splattering like blood droplets in the a fallen figure barely visible in the background shadows, ornate marble pillars, a hint of a shadowy cloaked figure, with a faint smile watching from the darkness near the edge of the frame, deep crimson and black color palette with golden highlights. Overall lighting, dramatic chiaroscuro cinematic lighting, high contrast, moody atmosphere, painterly digital illustration style, ultra-detailed textures on fabric and marble. Text overlay, bold, extra-large cracked shattered glass style typography reading the title, rendered in a two-tone yellow to white gradient fill with a thick high-contrast black outline and subtle outer glow. Positioned across the top third of the image, readable clearly even at small mobile thumbnail size. Aspect ratio 16:9, YouTube thumbnail composition, no real-world logos or existing franchise elements, fully original characters and setting.